და მეორე არის ეს. პირველი მეორე. 1 2 3 4. მაგრამ როგორ ისმის უკან ბაჩო? 1 2 3 4. როგორია? 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3. კი 1 2 3. 1 2 3. 1 2 3. 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3. მეორე 1 2 3. 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3. всё, ეს ორი კაია.
ერთი მერე ცოტა მაღალი როა ერთი ორი სამი ერთი ორი სამი ერთი 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 ერთი
1 1 1 1 1 1 1 2 3
დაიცა მიდი ახლა
1 2 3
ის ნახე ის 1
1 1 ხო მაგრამ პირველია ეს არის პირველი 1 1 1 1 1
1 2 1 2 3 1 2
1 1 1 1 1 ხო კაი. ერთი. ასე ერთი. ერთი.
დანარჩენი ორიც მომეცი და მე იმას. ხო შეიძლება რომ რაღაცა ყველას კონდეს თავიდან და მე გამოვაწყო. კი, მაგას მოგიწესრიგე. კი ბატონო. ერთი მომეცი და დამატებო. და მე და ამას დაგიხო. Hello, Ambassador. Thank you so much for coming.
Ambassador for Brazil.
How do you do? Hi. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you, Ambassador. Walk us through how we've gone from end of history, identity, and then some broad questions, but then some specific ones.
Okay.
Try to make it as conversation as possible. I listened to the thing you did with Richard at American Interest. That was good.
I said in any
Good.
one of them.
I may ask one or two of the same questions. I joked with Nino. I said, geez, I wish I had read the book before we did this.
David, you want me to be on this side?
Yeah, if you'd be on that side.
Okay, if I could get your attention, please. If you could take your seats. So, my name is Francis Fukuyama from Stanford University. I'm really delighted to be here in Tbilisi at this event. However, before we start the event about my book, I would like to say a couple of words about a new Democracy Frontline Center that is being created with the help of the Economic Policy Research Center and Nino Evgenidze. We think that this is an important initiative because Georgia is important. Georgia, along with Ukraine, are countries that are really at the center of a global struggle over democracy. And I think that a lot of us in the United States and in Europe feel that if Georgia does not succeed as a democracy, then it has larger implications for the entire region and for the world as a whole, because democracy is under threat. So I will let Nino say a few words about that.
Thank you so much, Frank, and thank you so much for your support to our country, and we are really honored and having you here almost like a fourth year now, and for your support, because you are doing this great job to having the Leadership Academy for Development. And we're in this year, now we're celebrating the 100 fellows in Georgia who are really change makers and who can really make a change in this country. And really, it's a great honor again, and the initiative which we come up with together with the Stanford University, with Professor Fukuyama and the Ajara Hospitality Group with Valery Checheria, which means to open the Democracy Frontline Center in Georgia, which kind of to uniting the freedom fighters, human rights activists, and other change makers from the also from the public and private sector and entrepreneurs in this country to make this country and the frontline countries better, to fight against the corruption, autocracy, kleptocracy, and to defend the values which are very important to these countries, to defend ourselves from the neighboring neighboring countries as well. And, yeah. Thank you so much, Frank, for this great trust for us, and we will believe and we promise that we're going to make the center really work and to be a part of this global movement for democracy and freedom. Thanks a lot. Valerie?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to being here with us, first of all, and to support the country and economy and democracy. Yes, our part will be like the little part, because we came up with the idea, and Nino convinced me to start this initiative, and we gave the office at our Stamba hotel, because I believe us and my group and all of us together, we are like one of the biggest supporters of everything new Georgia, new hospitality. So this center will be located in that Stamba hotel on the 3rd floor, and that's going to be our help from the business side, and I believe that it's going to be like the more and more business is going to be involved in this. Thank you
so much, Valerie, and I would like to thank also the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, because we have the book presentation here, which was supported by them. The translation of this book, and in US this book came to the September 11, and we are now October 22nd, and we have the a Georgian version of this book, and we are very proud of it. And I would love to thank also the Bank of Georgia University, Free University, DIO, and other Stanford alumni from the LAD program and also Draper Hill programs, which are contributing for this program and for future to having more freedom fighters and value-based people in this country. Thanks a lot. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Fukuyama and David Kramer, our long-standing friend, to having the conversation about the identity policy. And also we're really very happy that you agreed to be a chairman of the board for the Democracy Frontline Center. It really means a lot for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm David Kramer, as Nino said, now with Florida International University, but a pretty regular visitor here to Tbilisi, and I'm thrilled to be back. I was here last month, but Frank, you and I were doing something similar, I think, in March of last year when the Leadership Academy for Development last had its meeting in Tbilisi. And it's a real honor for me to be here with you tonight and with Frank to mark the release and publication of his book, Identity, the demand for dignity in the politics of resentment. We'll stick to the English version here tonight. We'll let everyone else read the Georgian version. But we'll launch right into a discussion, and then we'll have Q&A with you, the audience, after a little back and forth that we'll have here this evening. Very timely book, very important book, so I really commend you, Frank, for producing this. Now, let me ask you, though, to walk us through an earlier book you had done after an article from 1989, The End of History, which, as you note, ended with a question mark in the article. But walk us through End of History, 89, 92, to Identity in 2018.
Okay, thank you, David. So, in 1992, I published a book called The End of History and the Last Man. Many people only read the title of the book, and they actually didn't read the book itself. They also, in particular, didn't read the part of the book about the last man. So the end of history is not my phrase. It comes from the German philosopher Hegel, who said that history was progressive. So history, in this sense, you can use other terms like modernization or development. And the question was, where does the process of modernization lead to what is the end of the process, meaning what is the target or what is the highest form of development that exists at the end of a process of social evolution. And Karl Marx picked up this idea from Hegel. He said the end of history is communism. And my point in the original article was that it didn't look like we were ever going to get to communism. I wrote this in the winter of 1988-89 when Gorbachev was the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, and things were happening in the Soviet Union that made it clear that they were not they really no longer believed in this basic Marxist framework. And so I said, well, if that's the case, the end of history is not going to be communism. It's going to be some form of liberal democracy tied to a market economy. And I think that that's still true. Now, the part of the book that people didn't read was the part about the last man, which is another phrase from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche said, the last man is the man who appears at the end of history. In other words, the man who's created by a democratic, liberal society that is peaceful and prosperous. And there's a problem with that because people want more than peace and prosperity. They actually want recognition. They want recognition for their inner sense of dignity. And in the book version of The End of History, I had several chapters actually about how this plays out. In a liberal democracy, we recognize citizens as equal. We give them rights. We give them rights to speech, to association, to belief, and ultimately to political participation by giving them a vote. But in the end, that's really not enough for a lot of people. People want to be recognized not just as generic citizens, but also as members of an ethnic group, members of a gender, members of some other form of common association that gives meaning to their lives. And this is particularly true when that group is marginalized or oppressed or not recognized by the mainstream society. And so identity really can take a lot of different forms. The most prominent one is nationalism, right? In all national movements, you get people who believe that their nationality is not being recognized because they don't have a state. So that's what's going on in Catalonia right now. The Catalans think that they've got their own language, they've got their own culture, but they do not have an independent state. Ukraine was part of the former Soviet Union. Ukrainians believed that they had their own language, they had their own separate history that was not the history of Russia, and therefore they wanted a separate nation. So all of these are examples of assertions of identity. And I said that this was particularly dangerous to democracy because many of these movements are built on a kind of irrational human impulse. There's a Greek word, thumos, that Plato uses to describe this inner demand that one's dignity be recognized by other people. And so this is what draws people into politics. They want to be recognized, you know, as Georgian, as Ukrainian, as Catalan, as Scottish, as whatever. And this is what a lot of our politics, you know, has focused on in recent years. There are good forms of it, and there are bad forms of it. The bad forms come when the demand for recognition requires that other people not be recognized, or when the demand for recognition becomes a demand for superiority. And this is unfortunately very common in the history of nationalism, where a legitimate demand for recognition as equal becomes a demand for domination over other people. I think that you see this going on right now in Russian nationalism, that Russians somehow, you know, in the 1990s felt that they were being disregarded by the West, they were being looked down upon by the United States and by the European Union, but they quickly turned this resentment into the desire to dominate all of their neighbors. So this was, this was all stated in The End of History and the Last Man, if you had read it carefully. The last part of the book were reasons why democracy may not be stable. It may not accommodate these demands for recognition by groups that didn't correspond to this universal recognition that is at the basis of a liberal society. So I must say, I even mentioned Donald Trump in that original 1992 book. The context in which I mentioned him was that one of the problems in a democracy is how to deal with very ambitious individuals. I created this word, megalothumia, meaning you have this spiritedness, this desire for recognition as superior to other people. And this is a problem in any democracy because democracy can be upset by tyrants, by dictators, by people that want this superior recognition. And the reason that we have constitutional government is to prevent the emergence of a single extremely powerful leader. That's why we have checks and balances. That's why we have an independent judicial system and a separate legislature and a free press and other important institutions that make up a democracy. What I said back in 1992 was that a capitalist economy is also a good arena where ambitious individuals can make a lot of money and they can satisfy their desire for recognition without necessarily going into politics, and I gave Donald Trump as an example. He, at that point, had made a lot of money as a real estate developer, and I thought that was going to be enough for him. But here we are 25 years later, and he's decided it's not enough, and so he's now President of the United States. I believe you in Georgia have a version of that, a certain individual that's made a lot of money and also wants to go into politics. And so, unfortunately, capitalism by itself isn't enough to absorb all of these energies. But those are some of the dangers that I was actually talking about all the way back in the early 1990s. And now, unfortunately, I think our world is shifting to one that's more organized around the theme of identity. So Viktor Orban, for example, in Hungary, has a very ethnic understanding of Hungarian national identity. He says that Hungarian identity is built on Hungarian ethnicity. Other leaders in the world are shifting their countries away from a liberal understanding of identity to one that's based on either ethnicity or religion. So Prime Minister Modi in India and his Hindu nationalist party, the BJP, is trying to shift Indian national identity to one that's based on Hinduism rather than the kind of secular identity that was created by Nehru and Gandhi. So there are many, unfortunately, many versions of this assertion of identity and the shifting of identity to these fixed either ethnic or racial characteristics, and that's unfortunately happening in my country, the United States, as well. But I'm sure we'll get to that part of the discussion.
Well, I have to say, to move ahead from where I was planning to be, you talk on page 83 about the rich man, quote, glories in his riches. And you say if one thinks about the class of global billionaires and asks what gets them out of bed every morning, the answer cannot be that they feel the lack of some necessity, but cannot have it if they do not make another $100 million in the coming months. And you go on to say, what they seek is not some absolute level of wealth, but rather status relative to that of other billionaires.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point about wealth, that the reason that we want wealth is oftentimes not that we need things or desire things. What wealth signifies is that I'm better than you, that I own something that you don't own, or I have an occupation that pays me so well because people value, who I am and what I do. And so I think that there's this confusion over economic motivation, that a lot of what we understand to be economic motivation is actually driven by this desire for recognition, for superior status. So you can buy a barbecue that you can grill food on in the United States, and you can pay $40,000 for this thing. Like, why does anyone need a $40,000 barbecue? Well, the reason they want to buy this thing is because the neighbor has only a $20,000 barbecue. And, you know, so I think a lot of our activity in the economic realm is actually driven by this desire for status and recognition, and not by the desire for just having things.
Talk a little bit about the politics of resentment and how that plays out, where there are groups or individuals seeking recognition, seeking their identity, feeling that they have been marginalized over the years, but then in pursuit of that recognition, it also generates resentment of classes that felt that they are being run over as a result of this recognition.
Well, so, you know, one obvious case is the one I mentioned already, which is Russia, where this feeling that they had gone from being a superpower to being just another country. You know, President Obama at one point characterized Russia as a regional power, and I think Vladimir Putin really hated that. You know, he really hated this idea that they're just another country in Eurasia. So, you know, that's one example. But I think unfortunately, one of the clearest examples of that is what's happening in a way to the white majority in the United States. So 50 years ago, if you were a white American, meaning descended from some European ancestor, you actually didn't think about yourself as an oppressed minority, because you were the majority. You know, you and people like you constituted the vast majority of Americans, and when people thought about what does an American look like, it would be a white American, right? But since that time, you've had this big upsurge of social movements, African Americans and the civil rights movement, women. And by the way, I think the average American back in the year 1950, I was born in 1952, so around the time I was born, would not just have been a white American, but a male white American, right? And so there's been a feminist movement, there's been a LGBT movement for gays and lesbians, there's been a movement on behalf of indigenous people, on behalf of disabled people. All of these people were not really included in the mainstream of American society, and they've demanded rights, they've demanded government recognition, compensation, you know, for their status, their inferior status, and that has made, I think, a lot of the majority community fearful that they're losing their place in American society. And I think that explains why opposition to immigration and also to foreign competition has become such a big issue, both in the United States and in Europe, because this is something done, I think, on the part of these former majority populations that are recognizing that they no longer constitute, you know, the mainstream of their societies. They feel that other groups are pushing them aside, and they want to, you know, they want to hold on to that status.
Let me pick up on two strands that you touched on, LGBT and the campaign for recognition of equality in that category, and then immigration. With LGBT, we see a pushback with Mr. Putin leading the campaign for preservation of traditional values. And it actually brings about an interesting coinciding of interests with some Western evangelicals, arch-conservatives, who see Mr. Putin as the upholder of traditional values. How do you see that dynamic playing?
Yeah, so that's something I think that is not really understood by outsiders. Putin is not, so Trump likes Putin, you know, there's no question about it, and none of us can figure out exactly what caused this, because it could be driven by his personal financial interests or something that happened in Russia, you know, we have no idea. But his appreciation of Putin is also shared by a lot of, especially religious conservatives in the United States, over precisely this kind of issue, that a lot of, you know, conservative religious people in the United States feel that liberals have shifted the culture towards acceptance of gay rights, and they feel that this is something that they didn't really approve of. Nobody asked them. You know, it was done by the courts or by the U.S. Supreme Court, and they're very resentful of that. And so I've seen statements made by leaders of, you know, Christian kind of political movements saying they have more sympathy with Vladimir Putin than they do with Hillary Clinton, because Putin is, you know, pretending to support these traditional family values or you know, conservative social values. And it means that the shift in American politics, where the right is now pro-Russian, you know, so this is this amazing thing. So the Republican Party, when Obama was president and he was trying to have a good relationship with Russia, you know, probably 5% of Republicans thought this was a good idea. You know, the other 95% thought Russia is a terrible, you know, menace and a threat to American security. Now something like half of all Republicans think we ought to have better relations with Russia. And it's not just Trump. It's not just Trump that's doing this, although he's obviously stimulated a lot of this, but a lot of it is because there's actually a kind of ideological affinity in terms of these values, and there's a common shared resentment that a lot of conservatives feel that their values have not been respected in this rush to legalize gay marriage, and they're resentful of this, and they feel that, you know, foreigners like Putin give them a certain, you know, support for their position.
On immigration, you write on page 133, the common objective of populist politicians in both Europe and the United States is to, quote, take back our country. But then you go on to ask, but what country are they trying to take back? How is this issue being exploited by ultranationalists who are trying to tap into concern, in some cases in the United States, for example, concern that the current majority of the population will soon be a minority of the population? Maybe not soon, but...
Well, I mean, it is going to be soon. So in California, where I live, we are already at a point where it's a majority-minority country. That is to say, white people constitute less than 50% of the population of California. I think there's 40 million of us. So I'm a good example, right? So I'm not a white person, and I live in California. So Asians and Latinos, Hispanics particularly, you know, are a growing part of the American population. And I think there's a lot of fear of this kind of rapid cultural change. And by the way, I don't think that this is completely illegitimate, because I think that rapid cultural change is very, you know, it takes a while for people to get used to the change that's involved. Something very similar is happening in Europe, where many Western European countries now have, you know, 10, 15, 20% of their population born outside of the country. In Britain, for example, in the last 2 years, almost 1 million Poles have moved from Poland to Britain. You know, that's in a country of only 60 million people. So that's a lot of people. That's a lot of foreigners coming in a very, very short period of time. And so I think it's, you know, it's quite easy for people to worry about whether that process is really, first of all, under control, and whether those foreigners can be adequately integrated into the larger society. So I think that part of the resentment is just pure racism and xenophobia, right? There's no question that there's a number of people that just don't like people that don't look like them. But some of the fear is driven by the fact that it's not legal. You know, in Europe, this was triggered by the migrant crisis after the Syrian civil war. In the United States, it's the large number of people that cross the border from, you know, from Mexico and come in illegally. And some of it is, you know, fears whether the dominant society can actually integrate properly. But there's no question that this is a really ripe field for exploitation by people like Donald Trump, who, you know, right now in the United States is, you know, there's a caravan of refugees coming from Central America, and he is using, you know, every every ounce of energy he's got, you know, to try to get his supporters upset about, you know, the threat that this poses to America's conception of itself.
There's also an economic dimension to it where, rightly or wrongly, some Americans, particularly maybe in the rural areas, are told these immigrants are going to take your jobs, in some cases in the urban areas as well. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of immigration? You also advocate more assimilation as a way to try to address this problem. But how is this issue being exploited in economic terms, too?
Well, so there's a lot of confusion about, you know, immigrants and the economy. In the United States, it's really about jobs, this idea that there's a fixed pool of jobs to go around, and if an immigrant takes a job, that means that a native-born person is not going to have the job. Now, in fact, economies are much more complicated than that. So, you know, there's any number of people like not Gordon Moore, who was the other founder of Intel, was a Hungarian. You know, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computers, you know, his father came from Syria. Sergey Brin, you know, was a Russian emigre. So if you ask yourself, how many jobs did, you know, Steve Jobs and Sergey Brin create in the United States? You know, it's enormous. And if you're trying to figure out how many jobs were net either lost or gained as a result of immigration, I think that overall immigration has vastly helped the American economy, but particularly at the low end of the labor market, where a lot of workers have been losing jobs to automation and, you know, technology. In general, there's a great fear that, you know, equally skilled people from Mexico, you know, are going to compete with them, and you know, there's a little bit more, you know, justice in it. In Europe, I think it's a slightly different worry that these foreigners are going to take advantage of the welfare state that exists in Europe without paying the taxes that are necessary to support that welfare state. So it's a slightly different concern.
In Europe, immigration, of course, is a big hot-button issue. The questions about the role of the EU itself, also an important issue. The sovereignty of states and the ability to decide for themselves versus Brussels deciding for everybody. You talk about Brexit as a key turning point in this whole challenge that we face. Is Brexit a sign of a breakdown of the order that we've had over the past decades, or could it be undone even? There's growing talk of doing a revote on that.
You know, I just spent a week in Britain, and I heard a lot about Brexit. So I do think it's a really fundamental break. I mean, Britain was never that committed to the European Union in the first place. You know, the other countries in Europe, especially Germany, had suffered from the Second World War, and they needed the European Union as a way of legitimating themselves once again. Britain was never in that position. They joined only in the 1970s, and it was a little bit reluctantly. They didn't need the European Union to give them legitimacy, so their connection to it was always, you know, much more superficial. And I think that in that case, what people didn't really understand about the Leave voters was that it really was immigration that was driving it. You know, they didn't like Brussels and the economic regulation, but I think that they were willing to tolerate a loss of economic output if this was the way to stop immigration, if this is something that could reduce the numbers of immigrants coming into Britain. I think that although in theory you could have a second vote, most of the people I talk to think that this is a really bad idea, because Brexit itself has become so polarizing in British politics that if they have another vote, it's going to deepen these divisions between basically two classes of people. You know, the one class of people live in London, they have college educations, they travel, they're well educated, they can take advantage of Europe, and you know, they get a job in another part of Europe, they marry somebody from some other country, so it's very good for them. But in you know, in the countryside, in smaller towns and villages, people are less educated, and You know, they're less, Europe means a lot less to them, and I think that's the fundamental social division that really is at the basis of the Brexit vote, and that's going to be much exacerbated if they put it up for a second referendum.
So we're here in a country that aspires to become a member of the European Union. It signed an association agreement back in 2013, a visa-free travel agreement, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. Is this a future they should aspire to? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Georgia should be part of the European Union, no question. So should Ukraine. So it actually is an identity question here, because there's basically two identities that, you know, this country could adopt. It could be reabsorbed into this Russian kleptocratic, you know, corrupt system, or it could be part of Europe, which represents, I think, something very different. You know, it represents impersonal modern government as opposed to this crony capitalist system that Russia has created for itself. And I think that that's really the big division that exists here and exists also in Ukraine. You know, these two understandings of which type of country do you want to be? Do you want to be a modern country, or do you want to be, you know, part of this older, you know, more traditionalist kind of power, you know, system revolving around autocratic power?
And yet you do have in the current administration in Washington a seeming interest in trying to chip away at the EU, supporting Brexit, encouraging Brexit movements in other parts of Europe. You had the President of the United States at the UN General Assembly last month stressing the importance of sovereignty, sort of questioning the role of the UN itself. Is this all part of the erosion that we're seeing?
So this is one of the weirdest periods in American foreign policy I have ever seen, because what you just described is the policy of one man, Donald Trump, who happens to be President of the United States, but it's actually not the foreign policy of the United States. The foreign policy of the United States is still being determined by a national security establishment that remains committed to NATO, remains committed to the European Union, wants to maintain alliances, does not like Russia. You know, the United States has imposed the most severe sanctions on Russia under the Trump administration that it's ever imposed on any country, really, maybe apart from South Africa. Much stronger sanctions than Obama did, despite the fact that President Trump doesn't seem to like it, but he doesn't seem to be able to affect American policy in this area. So we're just in a very weird period in American politics where the president's wishes don't seem to actually have much impact on what the United States actually does towards this part of the world.
You talk about political correctness, a movement in the United States in the university context, but also citing President Trump as someone who defies political correctness. On page 119, you write, Trump was the perfect practitioner of the ethics of authenticity that defines our age. He may be mendacious, malicious, bigoted, and unpresidential. How do you really feel? But at least he says what he thinks.
Well, that's true. So political correctness was really created by left-wing identity politics in the United States. So it's all about gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and it defines things that you cannot say in public because it's going to offend the sense of dignity of some group that's been marginalized. And that means that American politicians have learned to be extremely careful about the things they say. Hillary Clinton was probably the most consummate practitioner of this kind of political correctness, you know, that everything she said was gauged against the impact it would have against one identity group or another. And President Trump, you know, isn't like that. He goes and insults women, Mexicans, you know, disabled people. And I really do think that that was part of his appeal to a certain stratum of Americans, because those people were really sick and tired of having to be so careful about what you said. I mean, I think most people I shouldn't generalize, but people do have these racial, ethnic prejudices against people, and they say, why shouldn't I be able to express that? So I think that's what President Trump was capitalizing on.
We're in a country that in 2003 launched the Color Revolution movement with the Rose Revolution here. It was followed by the Orange Revolution movement. We have some Ukrainians in the audience here this evening. And in Ukraine, it actually occurred twice, in 2004 and then again in 2013-14, the second time at a much greater cost in human lives. But it seemed to have taken the invasion by Mr. Putin of Ukraine to really rally Ukraine behind a stronger sense of national identity. You also talk about Syria, where there lacks that sense of national identity, where you have a brutal authoritarian leader in Assad who has basically destroyed his country. How is it that it succeeded in Ukraine and it failed in Syria?
Well, it's not succeeded entirely in Ukraine, right? So there were major divisions between Russian and Ukrainian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, and Putin in the Donbass and in Crimea was capitalizing over, the sense of some Russian speakers that they actually didn't feel comfortable, with that kind of Ukrainian identity. So it's not something that's simply imposed on the country, but I do think that if Ukraine is going to succeed, it really does need to define its identity in a way that encompasses everybody that actually lives on the territory that it controls or makes a claim of controlling. And that means that that identity cannot be related to things that are simply possessions of Ukrainian speakers. So it's an important question here. Obviously in Georgia there's a lot of regions that haven't felt completely Georgian, and so it's a problem, but it's nowhere comparable to Syria. So in Syria you basically had a country that was completely divided by sect, by religion, by region, by ethnic group, by tribe, and the only thing that was holding it together was sheer autocratic power. The Assads basically used repression just the way Saddam Hussein used dictatorial power to hold Iraq together. And once those people were weakened, then all of the different parts of the country decided they're going to go in a different direction. And you now have this in not just Syria and Iraq, but in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Yemen, in Somalia. The whole region, it turns out, doesn't actually have states with a firm sense of national identity. And that should be a warning to everybody else. This is what happens if you live in a country that really does not have an overarching sense of national identity. If you lack that, then the moment that the center weakens, then everybody else is going to want to go somewhere else.
Just one or two more questions from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience, so please get your questions ready. It's often said of the United States that we are the melting pot, that diversity is one of our greatest strengths. You write on page 159, diversity cannot be the basis for identity in and of itself. It is like saying that our identity is to have no identity, or rather that we should get used to having nothing in common and emphasize our narrow ethnic or racial identities instead.
Yeah, so diversity is one of those words that is subject to a lot of political correctness in the United States. And there's a good form of diversity, and then there's also a problematic form of diversity. So diversity is an accurate description of the United States, and I think in many respects diversity is a good thing, especially for an economy. You need a diverse economy. You need people with different approaches, people that think differently from one another. That's what creates the possibility of progress, is that existing beliefs are challenged and so on and so forth. But there's a limit to the tolerable diversity within a society, because if people don't hold the same values and institutions in common, they can't have a democracy. A democracy cannot tolerate, let's say, a political party that is devoted to overthrowing democracy. Right, this is a big problem in Europe, where you had very powerful communist parties in France and in Italy, and these parties were explicitly, dedicated to a socialist revolution. And there was always this big struggle over whether you would actually incorporate them into a democratic framework, because they really weren't democratic parties. And so I think that illustrates the need for an overarching sense of national identity that is based on democratic ideas. If people don't believe in democracy in common, you're not going to be able to have a democracy. And that's why I think a modern national identity has to be based around democratic political ideals, where people agree on the legitimacy of their institutions.
So my last question, the role of social media in all of this. You write, and others have said, that they hope and expectation was that social media would open up new horizons for people who in many places had been cut off from true objective information of what was happening not only around the world but in their own country. And yet we also see social media used against activists and others striving for greater respect for human rights and equality and even identity. So how does social media play into this?
Well, social media is obviously great for identity politics, because using Facebook, you can be in touch with exactly the group of people that you want, and you can keep everybody else out. And it's really good for conspiracy theories, because when you used to have to talk to people in a restaurant or a bar or a cafe, and you had some ridiculous theory about this secret society that was actually controlling your government, you couldn't get anybody that would agree with you. But you go on the internet and you can find thousands of people that believe exactly the same ridiculous theory that you have, and you say, oh, that must be correct, because look at all these people who agree with me. And so I think that's one of the problems that we've got now. The other thing is, you have political actors that deliberately weaponize social media and want to use it as a tool. Putin was really good at this. He was one of the first to do this, but unfortunately in many countries a lot of people have figured out how to use social media in this fashion to undermine their opponents rather than to build any kind of consensus. And so this is something we've got to figure out how to deal with, because it's a problem for all of us right now.
So as I look out to the audience, let me also point out we have books over here translated beautifully into Georgian, which Frank has kindly offered to sign. So after we're through here, if you line up over there and come this way, we'll have a little book signing at the conclusion of this event. I did not translate it, just to be clear. Any questions in the audience? We have microphones, I think, somewhere. Any hands? Any volunteers? Right in front and then over there. So we'll start right here in the very first row if there's a mic, or I can give you mine.
Firstly, I want to thank you for talking with us.
Where are you?
I'm here.
There you are. Okay.
First,
sorry.
I want to thank you for talking with us and sharing your wisdom with us. We're really honored, and thank you for that. And the last question was about cyber domain. The cyber domain has shaped both millennials and both Generation Z. And we know you as a person who opposes post-humanism. And what do you think? How does the cyber domain and the involvement of cyber domain influence the post-human movement in a bad way, in a good way, and in general? What are your views about it?
Well, it's complicated, because I think that the cyber domain is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? It gives us access to information. You can find factual information very, very quickly these days in a way that was not possible when I was, a young student. It's very good for mobilizing people. So in the both the Orange and the Maidan revolutions, there was a lot of activism that was spurred by the ability of people to communicate on Facebook, and that was true in the Arab Spring and a lot of other uprisings against authoritarian government. But there's a lot of also psychologically questionable effects, because people also propagate bad ideas this way. It's a good way of propagating hate speech, conspiracy theories, and as I said, it tends to weaken a kind of collective memory in favor of a lot of specific smaller group identities that don't necessarily have anything in common with one another. There's this other big effect on young people which is being debated right now. So when I look at my phone, I stop reading the book I'm reading. And I think, you know, you keep hearing your phone go off and you start reading an email, or you start saying, oh, I want to shop for that nice coat that I saw in the middle of having a discussion with somebody. And, you know, you watch people on a date, you know, and they're both looking at their phones rather than talking to each other. So I think that, you know, it's complicating the way we humans are relating to each other in ways that may not be, you know, all that helpful in the long run. But I think at this point it's too hard to figure out, you know, what the net effect of that is going to be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Francis, I have a very short but direct question about European Union. You are mentioning there in this book about European identity. Do you really believe that the next step, or the only one way for European Union to survive, to build this European identity, and how it work?
Okay. So the founders of the European Union had this idea that national identities, you know, of Germany, of France, of Britain, were the cause in some sense of the two world wars, and so they really wanted to create a post-national Europe. Jürgen Habermas was really the theorist that talked about having a post-national identity. The problem was that the European Union had no resources to actually create this kind of identity. How do you create an identity? Well, first of all, a lot of times it has to be built around language, and there is no common language in the EU. You have to do it through the education system. You have to have a common mythology, common symbols, and all of this came very late, and it really never received the kind of investment that was needed to really produce an identity. So you had the Euro crisis in 2010. At the end of the Euro crisis, Greeks and Germans, I think, were probably more aware of how different they were than they were before the crisis. I think it made it very clear that actually there were these really big cultural cleavages within the European Union that the EU itself had really not mitigated. So unfortunately, I don't think that it's likely that such a European identity is going to be created anytime in the future. If by an identity we mean people are going to be more loyal to this idea of being European than it is to being Italian or Dutch or, you know, French or whatever. So for better or worse, I think the member state identities are still, going to be important.
Thank you for coming tonight. I want to ask you a question that might be hard for you to answer, because I'm going to ask you how somebody feels. Do you think Paul Wolfowitz or Secretary Rumsfeld will ever have their Robert McNamara moment where they feel sorry for what they did?
You have to ask them, you know. I mean, honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know Rumsfeld personally at all. I did know Paul Wolfowitz, but I have not talked to him in more than 10 years, so you really have to ask them.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. With your permission, I'm going to read the question. I'm a bit, nervous, so excuse me. What is the role of the wealth and income inequality in the upsurge of identity politics? Is there any blame to assign to the economic ideologies that preached almost absolute deregulation and made word, quote-unquote, redistribution almost a mortal sin? To propose.
Wait, you have to slow down also, because
I'm sorry. I apologize.
That's okay.
Has states lost the place it used to have, and should we reimagine concept of power altogether in the world of transnational corporations loosely accountable to any government? Does capital has unrestricted influence on the political process? If democracy is participation, isn't it also participation into policy making? And the most recent study I know of by the Princeton professor Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page indicate the direct proportionality of influence of wealth to policy making in the United States. My question, I guess, is also that does both left and right feel betrayed by political elite, by political correctness, and those who fill the void are those who most skillfully exploit these very basic human feelings?
Yeah. Okay, I didn't catch all of what you said. I think I got kind of the drift of it. I think we do have a really big problem in the current world that capital is very mobile. It moves from country to country. We have an entire class of oligarchs. You know, you have an oligarch here. Ukraine has a lot of oligarchs, but every single country now basically has a class of oligarchs who have a lot of money, and they can translate that money into political influence. And they actually oftentimes are not loyal to one single political unit, you know, because they can move around very easily. And I think this is a challenge for democracy, because democracy is based on one man, one vote. You know, we're supposed to have equal political influence, and yet de facto we're not equal because money, you know, buys influence. And I don't think we've really come up with a system for controlling, you know, the flow of money and the flow of political influence across international boundaries. And that's one of the things I think that democracies have to work on. And unfortunately, a lot of institutions in democratic countries actually help these people, right? So Wall Street and the City of London, you know, they help launder money, they help people hide their assets. So there's a lot of institutions that actually facilitate that kind of behavior.
Okay, thank you. In the first place, thank you very much for interesting presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. So my two short questions are, do you think in the first place that identity politics, sometimes taken to the extreme, is inimical to individualism, which is the pillar of liberalism? So again, my personal experience, sometimes when I just argue in the social media, oftentimes I am told, well, you cannot really understand it because you are male, or you are white, or you are like something else. So I am presented not as an individual, so they don't view my opinion and like my outlook as a person, as someone actually from Georgia or something, but as a certain group. So therefore, don't you think it weakens individualism, and it is generally, well, I wouldn't say dangerous, but well, not a very good trend in the Western civilization, generally speaking. And also political correctness. Don't you think that political correctness weakens freedom exchange of ideas because, well, it was conceived of very, very good ideas of not to be offensive, but today one can see that every idea which, well, doesn't clash with someone else is considered offensive. Thank you.
So there's a form of identity politics that I think is really troublesome, when you believe that your membership in a group determines the way that you should think about things, or you can't say certain things because you're a member of a certain group, right? So if you're a white person, you can't speak about certain issues. If you're male, you can't talk about certain issues. So there is a way in which identity politics does get in the way both of free speech and of actual open discussion about things. The political correctness issue is a little bit complicated. There's actually good reasons for political correctness. You know, if everybody simply talked like Donald Trump and said exactly what they thought about people of different races or, you know, creeds or genders or so forth, it would be a pretty uncivil world. You know, we'd be insulting each other all the time, and I'm not sure we actually want to live in that kind of world. So there's a reason for a certain degree of civility. That's a little bit different from political correctness in its extreme form, where you really can't say anything about anybody. But I think civility is actually quite important, and that means being a little bit careful about who you insult, because you don't want to insult everybody.
I think we have 3 more, right there, there, and here. Yes.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. I cannot stress enough how important it is in such a close vicinity to a lot of authoritarian regimes to
Hold it like this.
someone like you visit and preach wisdom about liberty and democracy. And with that being said, can I play a little devil's advocate to test the hypothesis of the book? So if you are saying that politics of diversity and resentment was born in the womb of liberal democracy, then how to improve it? Is it upon the leaders, or is it upon the society in its entirety to recognize this challenge and overcome it?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
No, that's a good question. So I think that the thing about identity is it's not a fixed category. You know, a lot of people that practice identity politics think that identity is defined by biology, you know, by your race or your ethnicity or the religion you're born into, your gender, and it's not true. Identity is socially constructed, meaning people define an identity and then you agree to be part of it. And so I think that what in a democracy you need to do is to have leaders that define a larger national identity that is capable of incorporating all of the people, all of the diverse people that actually live, you know, within that democracy, and give them some basis for common shared values and ways of communicating. And that's really something important. That's something a lot of leaders in democracies recently have not been doing. They've been exacerbating the differences instead.
Right here, there, and then the last one will be back. Right here first.
We are so delighted to having you here in Georgia and to discuss your new book in person. And thank you so much for coming up with this very interesting theory of demand for dignity, which explains what is happening in the modern crazy world right now, especially in our neighborhood, taking example of Turkey, Hungary, Poland. And thank you for this theory that demand for dignity and recognition is the key versus the utility maximization, which was the case back in periods from 70 to 2000, where we also observed increase of liberal democracy, called electoral democracy, globalization, global GDP growth, but also increase of this inequality, which actually led to this process. So can you tell us your view regarding future, what this nationalism, populism where can it lead us, and how can we prevent? And do you think we will see more social focused policies in the near future? Thank you.
So I have no idea what's going to happen in the future. I think that very dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future. So I think that this identity, the rise of identity politics is going to continue for a while. But there's also forces that push back against it, you know, because people actually need to live in a more open kind of society. So in France, you know, Emmanuel Macron was elected president to everybody's surprise, and, you know, kept at bay the National Front and you know, that kind of identity assertion on the right. And so I think there's a lot of possibilities for political leadership, but it depends on people actually getting up and defending democracy. I think in my country it's going to be really important how my fellow Americans vote in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, when we have an election. They can either approve Donald Trump's form of identity politics or they can reject it. And that's going to be a really big decision that they're going to have to make, and I hope it goes the right way. So, you know, we'll just have to hope for the best.
Batu, let me give you the last word. Let me go to him first. The gentleman right there. So,
hi, well, thank you for coming. I've got more of a general question, just to follow up what the lady said. would you have a blueprint in terms of how do we push back on resentment politics? Because, I mean, world politics pretty much has lost balance, I would say. Mm-hmm. So how do we bring it back?
So one really important thing is to realize that some of the resentments are actually legitimate. You know, that not everybody that feels resentful is simply expressing a kind of hidden aggression or doesn't have real reasons to be unhappy. In Europe and the United States, elites really screwed up over the last 10, 15 years. You know, we had an Iraq war, we had a financial crisis, there's a euro crisis, a migrant crisis. All of these caused a lot of pain and suffering, and you know, they were elite-driven mistakes. And so I think it's really important to try to understand the drivers of these resentments, and then if some of them are actually legitimate or at least partly legitimate, you have to meet those concerns. So that's, you know, I think about as good an answer as I can give. In other cases where the resentment is simply being driven by, you know, racism or just really hostility, you know, hatred, then you have no choice but to just oppose it very firmly.
Okay, last one to Batu.
Hi, Batu.
Hi, Frank. Welcome back to Georgia. It's always great to have you here and have very thought-provoking discussion. And it's not in, it's happening in real terms, a very rapidly developing and evolving world. So it's very timely for us to have this discussion with you. Once again, my big appreciation. So you mentioned the connectivity between technology and the politics. So what is the reason or the consequence whether the social media or information technologies brought identity politics or it just amplified? But there is a certain correlation. On the other hand, throughout the history of the mankind, we've seen that technology all the time affects politics, whether it was a nuclear bomb or any other technological breakthrough. So what happened in the US really is very important for several reasons. US is the leading country in terms of the technology. In the recent history, all the technological breakthrough happened in the US, and then sometimes its adversaries are trying to use it against the US, like the information warfare which Russia is trying to use against democracy. But that is kind of already a past. But now we have a very strongly marching artificial intelligence technology coming. How you would think artificial intelligence would affect the future of politics, identity politics, or in general politics? And is there any risk that our adversaries will use it against us?
Well, I guess there's two things to say about that. So the general replacement of human labor by machines is what's driving a lot of the inequality in the world. Like you think about self-driving cars, we see them all the time in Palo Alto. Think of how many, you know, taxi drivers, limo drivers, truck drivers are going to lose their jobs when this technology becomes widespread. And so it's a, you know, it's a broad challenge. That job loss is driving a lot of unhappiness and a lot of political resentment, and I think was really the trigger for a lot of the populism. And it's going to get worse. It's just going to get worse over time. And I'm not sure how our political systems are going to deal with that. So all I can say is I would recognize that as a future, you know, challenge that we have to meet. On how people are going to use it, I think that China already gives you some evidence as to the future. The Chinese are using big data, machine learning, AI, to control their citizens. So in China today, if you write a blog post on Weibo that the government doesn't like, you suddenly lose your ability to buy a train ticket or an airplane ticket or to get your kid into a university. And that decision is not even being made by a human being. You know, there's actually a computer somewhere that's making that decision. And so I think that you know, it's creating the possibility for a form of totalitarian government and state control over citizens that we've never seen before in human history. And it's very, very scary. So I hate to leave it at that kind of, on that kind of a pessimistic note. But.
Well, Frank, let me say in closing first my thanks to EPRC and Nino for organizing this event, to Konrad Adenauer for providing support to translate your book into Georgian, to Stamba Hotel for hosting this event, and thank all of you for coming. This is an amazing turnout to hear this conversation this evening. And please join me in thanking Frank Fukuyama for sharing with us tonight. And you can get your book if you line up over here that way, and if you want him to sign it, he's right here. So I guess I stay here. I think so.